Well, we've recently been going through the book of John on a Sunday morning, and we're going to conclude our time in the book of John with John chapter 21, verses 1 to 25, and it can be found on page 1180, and Phoebe is going to come and read that to us. Thank you, Phoebe.
John 21, the whole chapter, page 1188, Church Bible. Afterwards, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee. It happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, also known as Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two other disciples were together. "I'm going out to fish," Simon Peter told them, and they said, "We'll go with you." So they went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize it was Jesus. He called out to them, "Friends, haven't you any fish?" "No," they answered. He said, "Throw your net on the right side of the boat and you will find some." When they did, they were unable to hold the net in because of the large number of fish. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, "It is the Lord," he wrapped his outer garment round him, for he had taken off, and jumped into the water. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from shore, about 100 meters. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it, and some bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish you have just caught." So Simon Peter climbed back into the boat and dragged the net ashore. It was full of large fish, 153. But even with so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." None of the disciples dared ask him, Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came, took the bread and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the third time Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said, "you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep. Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which people would glorify God. Then he said to him, "Follow me." Peter turned and saw that the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. This was the one who had leaned back against Jesus at the supper and had said, "Lord, who is going to betray you?" When Peter saw him, he asked, "Lord, what about him?" Jesus answered, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? You must follow me." Because of this, the rumor spread among the believers that this disciple would not die. But Jesus did not say that he would not die. He only said, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you?" This is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. We know that his testimony is true. Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written.
Well, years ago, I was working down in West Cumbria for an organisation called NISCU. It works in schools, my role and my colleague were particularly involved in secondary schools, and we did things like school assemblies, RE lessons, things like that. NISCU is funded by local churches gathering together and also chipping in to support schools workers who can do that role full time. And one of the schools we worked in was called Nether School. It's the secondary school in Maryport. Some here might know it. And they invited us to go to a special day they were having. They were a number of different speakers from different places and different organisations. It was for the whole of their sixth form. And it stuck with me. One of the particular people who'd been invited along to speak. He was an ex-convict. He'd been in prison for a number of years. But before he was a convict, he was a drug addict. He'd been involved in the world of hard drugs, and that had then led him to a prison sentence. He'd amazingly been able to be rescued from that life, was no longer addicted to the drugs, and was now out of prison, and actually worked for an organisation that tried to warn young people of the dangers. So he was there at the school, telling people his story, telling people about the less glamorous side of drug addiction, in quite a graphic manner. It's really stuck with me. It perhaps stuck with some of the young people. I think that was the idea. And it was a great thing to do, what he was doing. I don't think he was a person of faith. As far as I know, that didn't come out, but he was doing a great thing. I don't think many people get into drug addiction, or who end up going down that road, get into it thinking that they're going to end up in the state that many end up in. I think people think they know what they're doing. They can just dabble a little bit. They won't be as stupid as other people who've got involved in drugs. And of course, if you've slid down that slippery slope, to get help and to get out, part of the process is recognising that you've got a problem, sort of flipping that switch to realise that you need help. And then for some who do get rescued, like this man that I've just been telling you about, perhaps they will then find themselves trying to prevent others falling into the same desperate state that they've fallen into, perhaps helping others with a problem. It doesn't just apply to drugs, does it? We could apply to that to alcohol and the work at Alcoholics Anonymous and other things as well. Well, why do I tell you all that? I'm not just reminiscing about the good old days in West Cumbria, and I mean there are many good days in Maryport that I can remember. But in fact, our first married home was there when we were first married. So many good days I remember as we got used to each other. Those who got married remember the severe adjustment that is. Anyway, lots of good days. But in John 21, our chapter, and you might find it useful to have it open in front of you. It's page 1180 if you use one of the church Bibles. I will refer to some of the verses there. In John 21, we're going to meet again Peter, the Apostle Peter. We've met him many times through the story of John. And we're going to explore a journey that he's on. There's 3 stages to it. And I've got the 3 stages that I'm going to help us see. We're going to look back and see there was a time when Peter thought he didn't need Jesus' help. I don't need your help, Jesus. Then we're going to see that he gets to a point where I'm desperate for your help, Jesus. And we're going to see a third stage. I want to help others find Jesus. So we're going to see that in Peter. You notice maybe it's a similar journey to the journey of that guy who was talking to those young people at Nether School all these years ago. Well, as we follow that movement in Peter, we perhaps can identify some of these things in ourselves. And we'll talk more about that as we go on. Now, if you are a visitor, I've already said welcome, and you might be new to looking at the Bible, and that's fine. We're thrilled that you're here, and we're thrilled that you want to take some time just to look at these things. We think this book's important. We think it has a lot to say to us in 2022. And so whether these things are familiar to you or you're coming to them brand new, we're thrilled you're with us, and we hope it'll be interesting and perhaps helpful this morning. Well, let's look at the first one of those things. That first stage, I don't need your help, Jesus. Now, to understand what's happening here, I think it's helpful to go back to some events earlier in John, and actually back in John 13. I've put these verses on the screen for you, but you'll find it on page 1172 in the Bible. But Peter has said to Jesus, where are you going? Jesus talked about the fact he's leaving. Jesus says, where I'm going you cannot follow now, but later. And Peter said, Lord, why can't I follow you now? I will lay down my life for you, says Peter. That's a bold claim. I will lay down my life for you. And yet only a few hours before the events, or a few days before the events that we're reading about in John 21, in John 18, we discover that although Peter had said, I will lay down my life for you, when he was put on the spot at the time of Jesus' arrest, and he was challenged, didn't you know him? Weren't you one of the people who was with him? In John 18, we read him saying, I don't know him. I wasn't one of those people. Luke 22 records similar things. Peter had said, I will lay down my life for you. And then he's saying, I don't know him. It's the equivalent today of somebody being in church on Sunday, singing God's praises, but on Monday, maybe not this week, because the bank holiday, Tuesday, let's say, at school or at work, denying Jesus. It's a massive switch in Peter. He said, I'll follow you, but then doesn't. In Luke's account, after Peter denies that he knows Jesus, Luke tells us he was full of shame and remorse. Or at least I take it that's why he goes outside and weeps bitterly. He doesn't want anyone to see him. He's ashamed and he's full of remorse about what's just happened. You can read that in Luke 22:62. But now, as John 21 opens, we're after the event of the first Easter, and it opens back in Galilee, where they're from. So the action shifts from Jerusalem, where the events of the first Easter have happened. We're back now in Galilee. Peter has gone back to his old life. His old life was as a fisherman. But it's not working. We read in verse 3, they've gone out to fish, but they caught nothing. They've been out all night and they caught nothing. Now, I'm no fisherman, but I do know it's not necessarily straightforward to catch a fish. They're slippery characters. I mean, literally, aren't they? But it's not easy to catch a fish, and so people have come up with all kinds of ways of doing it, haven't they? In some places in the world, they do spear fishing with specially designed spears. Some people can tickle fish, do trout tickling, and then pull them out of the water by hand. I think that's probably particularly tricky. Some of you use nets. In India, they build huge nets next to the shore that they lower into the water on a wooden frame and wait until fish swim above it, and then have a system that kind of flicks it up and like catapults them onto the land. Amazing. In those days, probably the fishing involved standing on a boat, something like this, and casting out a net that was then gathered in. because we're big industrial fishing. Anyway, but none of it's easy. None of it's easy. And here they're catching no fish. Now, it's perhaps not a surprise that Peter's finding going back to his old life unsatisfactory. He's been with Jesus for the last few years. He's experienced something better. And sometimes once you've tasted something better, it's hard to go back. I remember once one of our children in the high chair being given by a grandparent chocolate when we were trying to feed them fruit and veg. Hard to go back, isn't it? If you've had chocolate, you've given your toddler chocolate, it's like, oh, what's this apple you were giving me beforehand? Goodness me. Or you could say that about cheese versus any other food, I think. Once you've tried cheese, why would you go back to anything else? No, but you maybe it's different for you. But maybe you can think of something. That upgrade made it hard to go back. Imagine if you got upgraded to first class on an aeroplane. It'd be hard maybe to travel in cattle class anymore with the commoners. I don't know. I've never been in first class, but I would imagine it feels very much like a downgrade. It can be hard to go back. Peter's gone back to the fishing, and it's not really working out for him. But back then, beforehand, things had been different. Peter's quite a different person now. He's gone through a lot since then. Back then, there was another time that Jesus met them when they were fishing. We read about it in Luke 5. I've got some verses there. They hadn't been able to catch anything, very similar. Jesus tells them to keep trying, and they're able to catch a big load. And Peter, also called Simon there, saw this, fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord. I'm a sinful man." For he and his companions were astonished at the catch of fish they'd taken. They knew there was something different about Jesus. Back then, Peter said, "Go away from me." We've also seen already how Peter had kind of arrogantly said to Jesus, I would even die for you. In fact, he goes on to say, even if the others desert you, I won't desert you. I think both of these things reveal something about Peter's heart. The fact that when he realizes Jesus is not just an ordinary man through this fish catching incident earlier, he says, "Go away from me." He recognizes he's sinful. And then later when he says, "I won't desert you," it reveals something about his heart, and it reveals a kind of "I don't need you" attitude, or a self-reliance, or "I don't need you yet. Go away from me. I'm sinful." "I've got this, Lord. Leave it to me." He overestimates his ability when he says, "I'm prepared to die. I won't desert you even if the others do." And perhaps at the fishing incident when he says, go away from me, perhaps he's thinking, "I need to get cleaned up a bit first, Jesus. I need to get my act together a bit first." I think both those things reveal something going on in the heart. It's like somebody that Lucy and I know who their husband recognised that the lady was very busy, and so he organised for somebody to come and clean the house one morning a week. But the lady, being quite house proud, spent a whole day cleaning the house before the cleaner came, because she didn't want the cleaner to see dust or whatever. Kind of totally backfired. we might feel like that when it comes to Jesus, and that might be what's going on with Peter when he says, "Go away from me because I'm a sinner. I need to clean up my act a bit first, Jesus. I don't need your help to do that, but maybe when I've sorted my life out a bit, when I've cleaned myself up a bit, maybe then I could come to you." Do you see how that's also linked to the, I can do it, don't worry, even if all the others fall away, I'll be able to do it. It's kind of something, it's revealing something going on in our hearts. Well, there's the first stage of what's been going on in Peter's story, that he's at one time thought he didn't need Jesus, or he could do it himself. And actually that's where Peter and all of us start. But Peter's a very different person by the time we meet him in John 21. He's been humbled. And that brings me to the second thing, stage 2. I'm desperate for your help, Jesus. Because the big change that has happened between the two incidents of fishing, so the incident earlier on when Peter said to Jesus, "Go from me," and this incident that we read about in John 21, the big difference between the two fishing incidents, the big change between the two fishing incidents, is this time, verse 7, Peter can't wait to get to Jesus. At verse 7, then the disciple of Jesus said to Peter, it is the Lord. As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, "It is the Lord," he wrapped his outer garment round him for to take it off, jumped into the water, and he's off trying to get to Jesus. He's not, "Go away from me, Lord, because I'm sinful." He wants to get to Jesus. Do you notice the little eyewitness kind of detail there about him putting on an item of clothing? Later we get an exact count of the number of fish they caught in verse 11. Just little details that only come from an eyewitness account, I think. But anyway, Peter can't wait to see Jesus. And the big difference is that this time we are the other side of the cross, which is death, his resurrection. And that, of course, makes a difference for us too. And then we get this fantastic barbecue on the beach. It was a breakfast to remember. I bet it was it really stuck in their minds. I mean, a barbecue by the beach with fresh fish just caught in the early morning, be glorious any time, wouldn't it, I think? But so memorable because Jesus, who they knew was dead, was there. They'd been so distraught at his death. So imagine how much more memorable that made it. But I think maybe for Peter, the thing that would make it most memorable is the grace, the forgiveness that Jesus extends to Peter. Peter who had denied Jesus. Peter who said, "I won't desert you even if all the others do." Peter who'd said, "I would even die for you," and then did deny him and did abandon him. He's not written off by Jesus. So it's not just the miraculous catch that Jesus has just organised for them, but that makes it memorable, but that Jesus 3 times confirms that Peter is restored. And we've got it there with that strange kind of repeated thing that Jesus does with Peter. But Peter, who has denied Jesus 3 times at the time of Jesus' trial, and now 3 times, so to speak, is restored. And it's all happening again by a charcoal fire. So when Peter was denying Jesus, it actually says there it was a charcoal fire that he was next to. The smell of a barbecue. And here is Peter again there. And this time, 3 times, being restored. So in verse 15, Jesus says, to Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Do you love me more than the other disciples? And you might think, what kind of question is that, Jesus? In front of them, they're nearby. Do you love me more than the other disciples love me? I think, what sort of question is that? But that's exactly what Peter had previously claimed. Even if everyone else deserts you, I won't. But Jesus commissions him to a leadership position in the church. And he's not doing it 3 times to embarrass him or put him down, but to help Peter know that he's accepted. And it's not based on Peter's achievement, because Peter hasn't achieved, he's failed. In fact, failed 3 times. But it's because of grace. He's being treated with generosity. And actually in the Gospels, we see time and time again that it's not sin that keeps some people from Jesus, but actually self-righteousness, thinking that they don't need him. In fact, some of the biggest sinners that we meet in the New Testament accounts, in the Gospels, are the people who do come to Jesus. Some of the people who everyone thought was a sinner, they're the people who find it easier maybe to come to Jesus. Some of the people who everyone spoke well of maybe find it harder. Somebody once said it's not our weakness that keeps us from coming to Jesus, but our strength, when we think we've got some sort of self-reliance, something we can draw on ourselves. Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," but we spend our lives trying to not be poor in anything. You and me, we're addicted to our own self-righteousness. We want to think of ourselves as right. And that's a powerful temptation that can keep us from Jesus, because we think, I'm doing all right. It can stop you from being in a position where you can embrace grace. And Peter had to be humbled to learn that. But he was shown grace by Jesus. Well, time's pressing on, so let's just move to the third stage. I want to help others find Jesus. Peter is given a job by Jesus here as he's reinstated, and it's a big task. And it's a task that he's going to spend the next 30 years doing. In verse 15 and 16 and 17, he's told, take care of my sheep, or versions of that. Now, I'm not an expert shepherd. We've just heard earlier when the kids were with us the great story or adaptation of the psalm and remind us about shepherds and sheep and how God cares for us. But I do know that sheep can be stupid. They can be headstrong. They can be easily scared. They are nervous creatures. They're pretty defenseless against dogs and wolves and things. They're not pretty defenseless if you meet a bunch of them in a field, actually, and you're out on a walk. They've got horns. But they're pretty defenseless, but they are lovable. But I think great patience is needed, great compassion is needed if you're shepherding sheep. They need to be shown grace. They need to be given second chances, I think. And Peter has just been learning about second chances, and then is instructed by Jesus to do this job of looking after others. Back in John 13, when that we've already read, where Peter had said, I want to follow you. Jesus said, you can't follow me. He said, I would follow you even to death. Even if the others desert you, I won't. If we look at the context of that, I've just got it on the screen for us. Back in John 13, just before that bit, you see at the very bottom it says, Simon Peter asked him, Lord, where are you going? That was the bit we read before. But 2 verses before that, Jesus has said this, "A new commandment I give you, love one another as I have loved you. So you must love one another. By this everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another." Jesus said to Peter, "Shepherd my sheep." He was nothing new. He was just going back to what he'd been telling them before. Love for fellow believers. Following Jesus' lead, his example, and after Jesus departed with the help of the Holy Spirit, loving one another. And part of that is sharing the life-giving message of God's grace with other people. And eventually, after 30 years of leading, according to church tradition, Peter does get the chance to follow Jesus in death. Previously said, "I would die for you." And according to church tradition, 30 years later, he does do that. But he spent 30 years doing this job that Jesus commissions him to do, of taking care of others, of sharing the grace he's experienced from Jesus with others. So, we've seen Peter's journey. We've seen him earlier when he just met Jesus, when he said, "Go away from me." We've seen him being overconfident of his own abilities. We've seen him saying, "I'll not desert you," or whatever. We've seen him being humbled and realizing that he needs Jesus. We've seen that restoration and grace that Jesus shows him. And we've seen him being commissioned to show grace to others. And it's all the same for us. Our natural state is we think we don't need God. We're doing it okay ourselves. Or perhaps, I need to clean myself up a bit before you'd be interested in me, God. But the Bible says we need to come to the point where we realize we need Jesus. We need his grace. And then through that process, that will enable us to help others, to show others that kind of love that Jesus showed, that grace, that forgiveness, and take that message to a world that desperately needs it. We're going to share bread and wine in a moment, and then after that we're going to sing a song that reminds us of many attributes of Jesus, of how he came to bring God's message to the world. But it has this line. It says he came to seek and save the lost. And that's you and me. But it's also a message that we can share with others too. Let me pray. Father, we can so easily overestimate our own abilities. We see Peter doing that, but we can do that very easily as well. I think in our natural state, the Bible teaches that we think we don't need you. Father, help us to see the arrogance of that and that we do need you. Help us to see why Jesus came, why he had to die and was resurrected. Help us to see how we need him desperately. Help us to see the forgiveness that is on offer, not just for Peter, but for all of us. And help us to see how we have a part in that mission that Peter was commissioned with, but that all believers are commissioned with, to share your message of love, to share your forgiveness and grace with a lost and dying world. Father, I pray that you'd help us to do that. Amen.